hiccup, but nonetheless, let's go back to the webinar again. And for those of you who just joined us, we're talking today about how to reframe our grievance procedures and help create an environment where people can find a collaborative and positive outcome to their challenges, their conflicts and their disputes. So a very warm welcome to the webinar. My name is David Little. I'm the CEO and the founder of the TCM Group, and I have with me today Elaine Hepburn, one of our senior resolution consultants. So hello, Elaine.
Afternoon, everybody.
And Elaine will be picking up any questions that you ask. So much like Catherine, who put the note in that you can hear us, if you do have any questions through the webinar, anything about how that you might implement a model resolution policy, some of the questions you think that your managers might ask you, the relationship with your unions and what you think the unions might be asking in relation to the introduction of a model resolution policy, please do ask those questions at any time using the panel in front of you. Elaine will be picking those up as well as asking me a few other questions, and we'll try and make it nice and interactive, lots of fun, and Elaine is there, as I said, to ask those questions. There's a couple of polls we'll ask you as well, so we'll stop the webinar at a couple of times and just check in with you what your thoughts are about the introduction of a model resolution policy in your organisation. The good news is as well that everyone on the webinar, we have over about 50 people on the webinar today, so it's clearly of interest to people. You'll all receive a free copy of the latest version of the model resolution policy, and we'll get that out to you next week, and that will give you all of the information that I'll be sharing today. We'll also share a copy of the slides, and this webinar is being recorded, and this will be put on YouTube for your future reference, and if you wish to, you can share that with colleagues and trade union reps and others. Clearly, as an organisation, we can support you at any stage of developing your model resolution policy. And finally, it is Friday, the weekend's not far away. I hope you enjoy the webinar, and I hope that you get a lot of information from it, and I hope that it's useful and practical. So we know that organisations struggle with conflicts and disputes, and they go by many different names. Here's a little word cloud of the different names. I suppose on one level, who drank out of my cup? I want the window open. They're kind of office quarrels that I've sometimes seen almost petty, some might see as trivial. We know how quickly they can escalate though and move into more serious conflicts and disagreement, discord, discontent, challenge. The words grievance start to get used to describe the dispute. The blame game starts to be played out. We start to see people become more entrenched, positions adopted. And as the conflict develops and the psychological contract between the individuals and their managers break down, the language becomes centered around words such as bullying and harassment, discrimination. And of course, as we move from that stage of conflict into the later stages, we start hearing language around employment tribunals, settlement agreements, early conciliation, which late conciliation, I guess, but conciliation, the idea of trying to resolve these things through ACAS or through litigation and others. Of course, we're talking about conflict and how organisations are responding to and resolving conflict. We know conflict's going to happen. It's ever present. In fact, Bruce Tuckman tells us that teams that develop go through 4 stages of development. The second stage after we form is we storm. We go into a conflict stage, and we can only perform effectively and normalise our behaviours once we've been through a conflict. In fact, literature tells us that managers and leaders who stimulate conflict and encourage discord, positive disagreement, and manage conflict effectively actually secure higher performing teams and develop stronger outcomes and greater innovation in their organisations. So not only is conflict an inevitable aspect of every organisation that exists, managers who handle conflict effectively get better outcomes for their organisations and unlock the potential creativity and innovation within their organisations. So why is it that managers are scared to death of this stuff? Why is it that our organisations treat conflict with contempt? Why is it that our organisations see conflict as the natural but unfortunate but inevitable outcome of fallout of people being in an office, and our policies and procedures seek to mitigate the worst excesses of conflict and see conflict as something which is harmful and destructive? For me as a mediator, putting parties in a room together and encouraging them to have an adult conversation, a dialogue, an opportunity to listen, to talk, to see each other's point of view, is the most powerful way of unlocking the potential within our relationships. But it doesn't happen systematically, and the good news is the situation is changing. So a little bit about the TCM group. My background, I've been mediating now for over 20 years, which if you say it quickly doesn't sound so long. And then the TCM group has been in business now actually for 13 years. It's our 13th year this year. We first started working with organisations who'd often been dragged through a hedge backwards at an employment tribunal and said, we don't want that to happen again. And in sort of late 90s, early noughties, organisations came to us because they'd experienced the negative fallout from conflicts through courts, litigation and employment tribunals. And of course, there was a handful of organisations who saw mediation as fitting in to their ethical or values base within the organisation. So for a long while I was working with a number of early adopters who adopted mediation principles and processes for various reasons, but it wasn't a mainstream activity. In fact, many people saw mediation as a bit pink and fluffy, a bit huggy, a bit left field, a bit hippie-ish, I guess. What's great news now is those organisations are really changing their view of mediation and seeing mediation as a credible mainstream activity, driving business performance, unlocking economic potential and growth, and actually building strong relationships. So we've worked with organisations including Marks and Spencer's, BT, EDF Energy, Lloyds Banking Group, big Whitehall departments, even a couple of UN agencies to embed resolution policies and promote mediation best practice within their organisations. We employ a full-time team of mediators and trainers here at TCM, of which Elaine is one of those, and we're also appointing consultants across the globe working with us, delivering better outcomes at times of conflict and change. I'm the president of our trade body, the Professional Mediators Association, the leading organisation promoting excellence in mediation, and at TCM we're very proud to have been recently accredited with Customer First. We put the customer at the centre of everything that we do at TCM, and hopefully that will come through in some of the things that we'll be talking about today. So that's a little bit of a backdrop to the company. I know some people on the webinar know us, so it's great to be speaking with you again, and look forward to sharing some ideas with you. So why are we talking now about changing the attitudes to conflict within our organisations? Well, here we have a manager walking the tightrope of employee relations. No one told this manager they're on a tightrope, by the way. If you've implemented the Ulrich framework, and you'll know that much of this stuff is devolved to managers, my experience of working with managers is they're saying, great, I get it, but no one actually told me I had to do this. No one gave me the skills to deal with these difficult issues in the workplace. When I was recruited as a manager, I was recruited because I was a good plumber, a good academic, a good clinician. I wasn't recruited into my role as a leader because I had emotional intelligence skills, positive psychology skills, dialogue and negotiation skills. So our managers lack the competence, the basic skills that they need often to address conflict in the workplace. The good news is they're doing it at the breakfast table. They're doing it in the pubs. They're doing it with their friends. They're doing it in their families. But somehow we leave that at the door when we walk into our organisations. But your managers, I would argue, are the best mediators your organisation will ever have. But they don't have the confidence. They see other managers being dragged through draconian, unnecessary, time-wasting, unhelpful policies and processes which worsen the situation, which drive a wedge in the relationship, which take the psychological contract and smash it irretrievably. And those managers, quite rightly, in my view, often say, well, I'm not going to lift my head above the parapet. I'm not going to put my neck on the line. I don't know how to deal with the tears and the F word of management feelings. I don't have the capability. The organisation doesn't value this dialogue. The organisation, when the going gets tough, turns to grievance processes and discipline processes, which I feel just make my life more difficult. And as a result of it, we undermine the courage and prevent our managers from being courageous. And they're courageous people managing difficult situations in tough times. And I say to HR professionals, you know, the greatest HR paradox is, on one hand, you want to empower staff, drive talent, improve productivity, and become an employer of choice. And on the other hand, those same HR professionals are the custodians of a process, of systems and processes which damage relationships, make it difficult to manage, and undermine effective leadership and management. The worst of those processes, in my view, is the grievance process. And we'll talk more about the nature of grievance and why, for me, the grievance process is a pernicious and unnecessary aspect of most of our organisations. I'm yet to run a session, by the way, and I'd welcome your thoughts, and please do comment straight away, of running a grievance procedure in any organisation where someone can say to me, hand on heart, that as a result of a grievance process, the business benefited and the two parties benefited. If anyone has any examples of grievance mechanisms, other than being seen to offer some sense of procedural fairness to the individuals, but if anyone's able to offer me any examples of a grievance mechanism that's added real business value, I'd love to hear them, because I've asked for these so many times, and I'm genuinely yet to hear anyone offer me any guidance on this. So what goes wrong? Well, we know in grievance processes, we invite managers to have informal resolution. But when the informal resolution goes wrong, when the conversation breaks down, and of course to get into informal resolution, the term informal resolution sits at stage one of most grievance processes. So anything else that sits outside the grievance procedure is discretionary action. So the majority of disputes that are managed by enlightened managers and people, I'm sure, like yourselves, who want to get the parties in a room, don't operate in the context of a grievance. They're sub-grievance. They operate outside the radar. But in order to be able to get into informal resolution, we already have to submit a grievance. Well, if I'm submitting a grievance, I already feel aggrieved. I feel you've wronged me. I feel I'm right and you're wrong. We've already, just by the language of grievance, polarised the parties. We give the parties a level of uncertainty. They lose control of the situation. The amount of times parties in a grievance process have told me, all I wanted to do was to sit down and have a conversation, and we ended up having an investigator in, trying to identify the facts, and we had witness statements being gathered. That's not what I wanted. I just wanted the behaviour to stop. It creates a culture of fear. People don't feel safe in the organisation. They feel they'll be blamed, there'll be retribution, retaliation, recriminations as a result of the behaviour that they might be concerned about. Of course, in the current climate, which is changing, people who may be fearful about raising a grievance because being seen to be complaining about my manager might put my name on a redundancy list that's doing the rounds in the organisation. And what's interesting as we're coming out of recession is I'm seeing a lot of the suppressed conflict as a result of change that happened in organisations and as a result of people feeling anxious about raising grievances. Alongside the potential for economic growth, we're starting to see a lot of these suppressed issues come into the surface. And it may well be in your organisation. People are starting to feel a bit less fearful and a bit more comfortable about talking about these issues. The question is how equipped are our organisations to handle these situations? People feel that they can't trust each other. It leads to suspicion, which then leads to a breakdown in the sense of a loss of control. And that loss of control creating stress. Martin Seligman, the famous psychologist, the founder of the School of Positive Psychology, tells us that a loss of control is one of the biggest causes of stress and anxiety. So the questions would be, how are we working with occupational health specialists, with GPs and others to help think differently about how we manage stress in the workplace and in using mediation to underpin well-being initiatives within our organisations. We see cliques forming, alliances forming, because people have a sense of powerlessness. I was at a conference recently talking with Nita Clark, one of the co-authors of the Engaging for Success report with David McLeod, and she said at the conference that breakdown in trust is the antithesis of employee engagement. And we know that only 30% of our workforce is engaged right now today. 70% of our workforce are just turning up, doing the job, going home again. And yet a breakdown in trust is the antithesis of employee engagement. Well, my view on that as a mediator is if we give parties a voice through mediation and through dialogue, it helps to rebuild trust and therefore is a major contributor to employee engagement. And when informal resolution goes wrong, we see the rumours and the gossiping, the water cooler moments, because people don't feel heard. And people need to feel heard. They need to feel that they're being taken seriously. But grievance processes, the systems for dispute resolution, impede that sense of voice, unless the voice is at the water cooler or writing a 20-page email about how terrible your colleague is. That's not real voice. So our existing dispute resolution systems and processes, performance management, absence management, discipline and grievance in particular, are reactive. They're inherently adversarial, drawing on a binary justice model, right, wrong, win, lose. They polarise the parties into these camps. No one walks around your organisation thinking they're wrong. Our schema, our sense of self, defines us as being right. We don't walk around thinking we're wrong. So So suddenly we're in a conflict with someone else. We think we're right, we believe we're right. The other person's identified as being wrong. If that person was to approach us and have a conversation, they may in some way try and persuade us that we're not as right as we thought we were. That could be seen as an attack against us, against our sense of self. So we're going to defend ourselves. And what's the best form of defense? Attack or withdrawal. So your policies and procedures, unwittingly and unknowingly, are perpetuating a cycle of attack and counter-attack, defensiveness on the part of the parties, because it doesn't take account of the psychological and emotional needs that the parties have in a conflict. Your grievance procedure is worsening conflict in the organisation. And I have numerous examples from the mediations that I've done and my colleagues have done, where the very process that was designed to resolve the dispute resolution mechanism, actually worsened the dispute. The individual or business needs are ignored as a result of these mechanisms, and they impede creativity, innovation, dialogue, openness, the exchange of ideas that will help your business to become the most successful company it possibly can be. And this negative and corrosive culture of grievance, entitlement and litigation, they add no value to the organisation. They demean your values, they undermine what you're trying to achieve as a business leader within the business. It's not a time for business as usual. If we're coming out of a recession and seeing the potential for economic growth, as clearly we are, do we want to be relying on these failed processes and systems that don't deliver business benefits? Or do we want to find a new way of resolving our issues through dialogue, through collaboration and discussion? And the good news is organisations are finding these outcomes are driving real benefits to their organisations right now, today. It's not a time for business as usual. So the TCM Model Resolution Policy was I was going out to organisations and have been for a long time highly critical of the grievance process. But as a mediator, I'm a great believer in actions as well as dialogue, and I felt that as someone who was being critical of grievance processes, I perhaps needed to offer organisations an alternative. So last year I wrote a policy. It was the first time I've written a policy, and it was a policy called the Model Resolution Policy. And I launched the Model Resolution Policy in May last year at the Law Society with over 100 delegates. And at the Law Society were a number of organisations, including one organisation in particular, Kent County Council. And these organisations, at the end of the presentation, were asked, would you be looking to introduce a Model Resolution Policy within your organisation? 85 of those 100 attendees' hands shot straight up, and we've been working with those organisations to help them implement them. But Kent, a large local authority, notified me just before Christmas 2013, and they're happy for me to share this, by the way, so I'm not disclosing anything that I've not been given permission to do so. But Kent County Council, just before Christmas, went through the final stages of consultation and involvement of all of the key players, including the unions, to embed a model resolution policy as an alternative to their grievance procedure. And what we're seeing now is organisations are coming to TCM and saying, we agree with you, David. We agree that this grievance process, which is formal and adversarial, judgmental, blaming, it's not good for our business. And even in organisations where there are low numbers of grievances being taken, and we're seeing a kind of sub-level of activity of dispute resolution, even those organisations are saying, but the grievance procedure is actually the reason people aren't taking grievances out. And if we had a resolution policy and a resolution philosophy and a resolution culture in our organisation, which was about talking and empathy, dialogue, non-adversarial and collaborative approaches, which are interests and needs-based rather than positional, which promote win-win, symbiotic relationships, mutually advantageous relationships, then that's aligned to the culture, the values that we want our business to be. So organisations are transforming and reframing grievance to resolution, and this is what it looks like, and this is how it works. It's a courageous decision, by the way, to do this, because we've had grievance processes for 30, 40 years now. And organisations will often say to me, but David, are you allowed to do this? Are you allowed not to have a grievance procedure? And the message from ACAS, from us and from many others is absolutely right. There is an ACAS code on discipline and grievance. It doesn't mean you have to have a policy called a grievance procedure. In fact, many organisations would offer opportunities to resolve disputes far in excess of what ACAS Discipline and Grievance offers. And what Andrew Waring, the Chief Operating Officer from ACAS, said at a conference I was talking at with him recently, is this offers a very positive tool for dispute resolution. And if you follow the the Model Resolution Policy, then it's not going to leave you in any better or any worse state at an employment tribunal. You would not be subject to being found to be providing inappropriate activity or an unreasonable behaviour by offering a resolution process as an organisation. So it's a real change, but a courageous change for an organisation who've had this process embedded for some time. So what's different? Let's focus on the differences, and then we'll talk about how you might want to implement a policy within your organisation. Well, if we take grievance procedures, there are normally 3 or 4 steps to the grievance procedure. Informal resolution tends not to work. By the time you're in informal resolution, you've already submitted a grievance, you've already, the camps have been drawn, the line in the sand has been drawn, the positions have hardened, and so we move quite quickly into stage 2. Which tends to be a more formal stage, and more of an investigations-based stage, trying to understand what's happening. HR tend to get involved. And what we're saying through the Model Resolution Policy is let's focus on early resolution. Let's focus on the role that managers and leaders can play in helping the parties to find a constructive outcome, offering mediation within the organisation where mediators are accessed internally or externally to help the parties find a satisfactory outcome. Training managers in better resolutions to spot issues early, where HR coach and mentor managers to have difficult conversations, where HR are no longer gone to late in the day because managers are unable to cope, but managers are accessing support and coaching from HR to help them get a better outcome at the very beginning of the conflict cycle. So the procedure itself is values-based and person-centred. There's a much greater triage of cases at an earliest possible stage. So managers and HR professionals will be trained in how to spot conflicts early, how to recognise strong emotions, how to handle strong emotions, how to get parties around the table, how to overcome obstacles and barriers to dialogue, how to normalise talking to each other. I map conflict within organisations, and I'll often list on a simple sheet of paper the forces in favour of dialogue and collaboration, and the forces operating against dialogue and collaboration. And the forces acting for dialogue and collaboration are normally there's 4 or 5. The forces acting against, there's normally a long list going over a number of different pages. So this is about recalibrating the organisation, so collaboration and dialogue are seen as key normal parts of your culture. So there's an increasing emphasis on early resolution and mediation. Mediation itself remains voluntary, but it's much clearer from you as an employer that you would expect your employees and managers and others to give due consideration to dialogue and facilitated conversations, mediation, whatever you may call it. That it isn't just acceptable for an employee to say, I can never sit down in a room with that person ever again, and then that prompts going to a stage 2 investigation. That in actual fact what you would expect your employees to do is to listen, to speak to a mediator, to consider what mediation can offer them, and to make an informed decision about whether or not mediation is the right route to resolution from them. A much more adult-to-adult conversation. And as I said, it's compliant with the ACAS code. Certainly at the later stages of the formal process, there's the right to representation and the right to appeal. So we're not removing any employee rights. They're being moved, however, to the end of the resolution process rather than at the beginning of it, where everybody feels, as soon as they're taking out a grievance, that this is going to result in someone being dismissed. It just doesn't happen. People's expectations are false, and the actual process is woefully inadequate at meeting those expectations. When people experience grievance, they say to me they want the behaviour to stop, they want to be heard, they want to understand what's gone wrong. Those are the 3 things people want. This is what the Model Resolution Policy can deliver. It also offers toolkits for HR professionals on how to spot, handle, resolve conflict, how to coach managers to get better outcomes, and really to underpin the Ulrich model, in my view, to help managers deliver better business outcomes by managing conflict constructively. There's support for managers and helping managers to spot cases, to have difficult and courageous conversations, to secure better outcomes. And there's also guidance for employees about how to think about what you want to say, how to kind of mindfulness for employees, considering how you're feeling. There's empathy advice, how to consider how the other person might be feeling. I mean, this is another area which is implicit in the model resolution policy, is empathy. Grievance processes create an empathy deficit. There is no empathy in grievance processes, and it just doesn't exist. Whereas in the resolution policy, it's all about empathy. It's all about listening. It's all about talking. It's all about dialogue. So it promotes and encourages positive relationships. It promotes constructive dialogue. And it's about managers and leaders walking the talk. It's about giving managers and leaders the competence, the confidence, the capability, and the courage to manage these situations. So Tess, thank you very much for your questions. So I'm going to park that there, and Elaine will look at that, and we'll have a little questions and answer session in a moment. So thank you for that. And much like Tess has just asked this question, if any of you have any questions at all, please do feel free to pop them into the box there, send them through, and we'll pick them up in just a moment, Elaine. That's nice, nice to see that. Okay. Great stuff. So the model resolution policy draws on 5 key principles: fairness, respect, mutual respect, empathy, as I've talked about already there, dignity, and dialogue. And those are set out very clearly at the beginning of the model resolution policy. So it's clear when your employees start working with you, when your employees experience the difficult times, when your managers experience conflict and tension in their teams, which they will face, this is what they can draw upon. And again, we can offset that against the values within grievance procedures, which I've already set out: polarity, binary, adversarial. It's almost, I know it rolls off the tongue, but it's a significant change for people within organisations, a change in values and a change in ways of thinking. So I'm going to talk in a moment about the structure and content of the resolution policy, but I'll probably just pause for breath there, and Tess, we'll come back to your question now. And again, if anyone has any other questions, please do feel free to ask them. So, Elaine.
So what I'm understanding from your question, Tess, is that your question related to sickness absence and the problem of people not raising issues until the sickness has escalated to such an extent that they're actually, the leave work, they go off on sickness, absence or leave. And it sounds a bit like you're referring to the kind of culture of not talking about issues, you know, not nipping things in the bud, it being difficult to have these sorts of conversations at work, and therefore it resulting in people, you know, being off on sickness absence. And leading into that, you've also asked the question, if people say that they don't want to talk, they don't want to engage in dialogue to try and resolve things, because actually talking to that person exacerbates those issues, those sickness you know, sickness problems that they're having. So the question, I suppose, to you, David, would be, how would an organisation go about trying to manage some of those excesses before it gets to that stage?
Great questions, Tess. Thank you so much for those. I think the issue of sickness, one has to take this very, very seriously. People feel very stressed, and some people need to remove themselves from the workplace just to be able to give themselves some strength. But you can't resolve conflicts watching Homes Under the Hammer. And for me, once we've been out of the workplace for a couple of weeks, I think what I'd be advising HR professionals and managers is to be actively supporting that individual to come back into the workplace. In fact, for an HR professional under the model resolution policy, as soon as an individual needs to be off sick, obviously they'll speak to their GP, they may get a fitness note, and we know the fitness notes actually don't often tell us enough. But I would be working closely with occupational health, HR, and ideally getting information from the employee and their manager about returning that person to the workplace and addressing issues quickly and effectively to give them the confidence to return. I've done return to work mediations after 12 months, 2 years, and the longest we've ever done is a 4-year absence from the workplace. 4 years is just, it's just the distance between you and the workplace is so vast, it's a gulf, it's almost impossible to resolve. And of course, if you've been away from the workplace for an extended period, you come back in, people are already fraught and under pressure because you haven't got the resources. You feel fragile. The situation in the world of work has moved on. the manager or employee, the colleagues that you were having some tension with are still there, and have you got the resilience to handle these situations? So I'll be saying to HR professionals is building in a return to work program, focusing on employee resilience, and offering an opportunity for those issues to be raised face-to-face through dialogue. In terms of people feeling that exacerbating the issue by talking to them, it will worsen the situation. It does take enormous courage to come into a room with the other person. But avoiding the situation, suppressing the situation, that leads to irritable bowel syndrome, bad back, stress, physiological, psychological harm, emotional harm. Talking it through in an adult-to-adult way with the support of a skilled mediator who creates a safe environment for issues to be surfaced and aired in a way where the parties can talk and listen and be heard, for me is a very powerful way of resolving issues. And I've sat with people at the start of a mediation process who have got in them the inner strength to have a conversation, but they are scared to death to sit down. They've got bricks in their belly, as one lady described it to me. But at the end of the process, what the parties turn around to me and to each other and say is, why did we not do this earlier? You know, you're not that monster I thought you were. You do feel as frustrated and sad as I do. I just didn't know that because we weren't talking with each other. And dialogue and finding route to resolution through conversations and listening, for me, actually doesn't exacerbate health problems, Tess. It is the only way of resolving those health problems. But we have to listen to people. We can't be, can't be pious about this. We can't say, oh, yeah, mediation is the only way forward. We have to engage in an adult conversation and respect those concerns that people bring and find a resolution that is respectful to them.
I just pick up on that, Dave, just about the first bit of Tessa's question. Is there anything an organisation can do to put in place to kind of change the culture around these conversations being less taboo earlier on, so that people don't get to the point where they're going sick, they're able to talk through things a bit earlier on?
Absolutely. I think for me, when I was advising an organisation, does dialogue and collaboration sit in your values statement? Is dialogue and collaboration built into your systems and processes? Do you train your managers, or do you even recruit your managers against the leadership competency framework, which has empathy, dialogue and collaboration built into the competency framework? Are those managers skilled through their professional development, through their appraisals, to actually deliver the kind of organisational values that you want them to deliver through collaboration and dialogue? If those things aren't in place, then perhaps it's no surprise that our managers feel uncomfortable and ill-equipped to have these conversations. They don't happen, and then it becomes culturally normalised to suppress and avoid conflict. And we have to then have some remedial work to resolve that situation. So from an HR director's perspective, or from a board perspective, I'd start looking at the values, the culture, the systems, and then how they drive behaviours, codify the behaviours in a competency framework, and then from that would then equip our managers and employees to have a normal dialogue and a conversation with each other, therefore mitigating the worst excesses of destructive and harmful conflict. There's loads of questions coming through now. This is fantastic. Thank you. So let's have a look. What I'm going to do is I'll carry on with the presentation for a while while Elaine's reading through the questions. But these are really good, so thank you very much. And we will we'll carry on and come back for some more questions in a moment. So carry on firing away. They're really helpful. Thank you. So let's move into the structure and the process of the actual model resolution policy as an alternative to the grievance mechanism. So an issue will be raised by an individual employee. They can raise that with a manager, union, HR, and each of those individuals are trained in how to triage and spot an opportunity to be able to resolve the situation. So how to deal with strong emotions, how to listen effectively, active listening skills, identifying needs, recognising the difference between interests and needs, and helping the parties to find an outcome that is mutually compatible with the other party. So that issue will be raised and triaged by a manager or an HR professional. And of course, we've devolved early stage grievance resolution through the Ulrich framework to managers. So this sits very comfortably with the devolution of an HR function. But of course, underpinning that would be the support, coaching, mentoring that HR would provide. We don't want to just leave managers out in the cold. So I'll be looking to HR to be supporting managers there. That may well be an issue being raised by an employee against a fellow employee, or by the employee raised against their manager, and that can move into an early resolution process. That might be a resolution meeting between the employee and their manager, or it may be a mediation undertaken by a more senior manager who would bring the two parties together. Where the more senior manager or the parties don't feel ready to come in a room together, or the senior manager is conflicted because they have a personal relationship or a personal knowledge of the issues, the organisation would have access to internal or external mediators who are accredited by the Professional Mediators Association and who are working to a skilled level. And so, for instance, Transport for London, London Underground, big organisations, Marks and Spencer, BT, those that we've trained and set up mediation programs for, they have a pool or a panel of internal mediators. Smaller charities and smaller businesses might have half a dozen or less internal mediators who are available to provide internal resolution and internal mediation support as part of trying to find a positive outcome. There may be issues that are maybe more serious, relate to more serious allegations of misconduct or wrongdoing, or where an employee feels that their employment rights have been impeded as a result of someone else's behaviour. And that may move into a more formal resolution. Formal resolution would sit with HR. Again, HR would triage the case to try and find the most suitable route to resolution. Again, that may be to push back to mediation. It may well be through the triage, which is a needs and interest-based triage. You identify the need for dialogue, and that can be resolved through a mediation process. However, HR might identify the need for a more formal investigation to establish the facts. That may result in a formal resolution meeting, which would formally be your grievance meeting. And of course, your employee would have the right to representation at that meeting. A determination would be made, and the individual employee would have the right to appeal that process. However, the appeals process and also any determination or processes would also be able to refer the cases back to mediation, particularly in issues around bullying and harassment, which sit very comfortably within this process. Where it's a case of bullying and harassment where the manager has offered mitigation for their behaviour, there may be some disciplinary sanction made, but it's not dismissal. It might be a warning, a written warning, or a final written warning. Disciplinary panels, appeals panels are advised to think about mediation as a restorative process, as part of helping the parties to restore a stronger working relationship on the back of the issues being raised. Gosh, there really are a lot of questions coming in now. So, have we got any questions about process there, Elaine? Thank you.
We might have to actually be quite selective actually about the questions that we're able to answer. We've been asked about 10 in the last couple of minutes, so I'll try and pick out the kind of main themes so that people do get their questions answered as much as possible. The one that relates most closely to what you're talking about, David, I think, is there was a question about from somebody to everyone really about those organisations that have adopted it. How have they communicated it to the staff, and does there need to be any changes to the contract of employment when embedding a resolution policy as opposed to a grievance policy? Fantastic.
Well, if I talk about the Kent experience, Kent County Council, I'm delivering a workshop. So a lot of work's been done within the organisation to secure key stakeholder engagement and key stakeholder buy-in, unions, occupational health, HR, senior managers, members and others. And I'm then delivering some awareness workshops and round tables within the organisation to ensure that the organisation is communicating the new approach, and organisations then develop an internal communications plan. So again, we're working with a very large organisation, 150,000 employees, to embed this approach within bullying and harassment cases, and we're working with that organisation to develop an internal communications strategy. In terms of it sitting within the employment contract, well, that's organisational or context specific. Not all organisations have a grievance procedure as part of the contract. They might say in the contract of employment we have a grievance procedure, and we may amend that from time to time. Increasingly, organisations would refer to a dispute resolution clause or a dispute resolution procedure. My advice to any progressive employers out there would be to make it clear in your contract of employment that any disputes will be sought to be resolved collaboratively, where possible through mediation, and that you have a resolution policy to enable that to happen. Obviously, if you're a unionised environment or a works council, you would consult on that widely, but many organisations, the grievance procedure sits outside of the employment contract. So I would recommend that you take that on a case-by-case basis, if I could put it that way.
Right, and that question was from Katie Richards. Thanks ever so much for that, Katie.
Yes.
I hope that has answered your some of your concerns there. There are a number of different areas that people are asking about. One that's come from Lisa Dorman is around how does it work cross-culturally, specifically when organisations are working across different countries in the world and travel might not be possible. Would it be possible to implement this policy through alternative means rather than face-to-face meetings, David?
Yes, absolutely could. I think that's a great question. Increasingly, as we're working with global organisations, we're starting to find innovative ways of having these meetings. Skype, I don't know if anyone's on the call who doesn't acknowledge Skype, but Skype must be doing something incredible, because the Skype technology is just becoming more and more stable every day, and we're now using Skype as business on a regular basis. I know an increasing number of organisations are. And we have an online dispute resolution facility called Apaxio. We can use Skype to be able to bring people together. We're using Citrix here for this webinar today, so we also have access to GoToMeetings through Citrix systems. So the software that is we have access to now as an organisation, and also for you as employers, is even from 12 months ago is far more advanced. So there's a lot that can be done. What I like about the model resolution policy is it cuts across cultural differences. And grievance procedures are it's a sort of westernised notion of justice, and it's not necessarily, it's kind of culturally specific. Whereas the notions of dialogue, engaging with each other, listening to each other, cut across so many cultural differences. Okay, we have to take into account different nationalities and different cultures, but talking to each other, listening to each other, engaging in adult-to-adult dialogue, where the organisation values that and sees that as a driver of innovation in our organisation, where we feel valued and we feel we have a voice. For me, that cuts across so many different cultures, and I think the model resolution policy is an example of a progressive policy that actually works in a globalised environment, in an organisation which has offices across the globe. So with the mix of the policy and also greater use of information technology, this is a great way for organisations to drive resolution in a whole variety of different environments.
We've got time for one more question?
I think we have, yes.
So another question, again, about a kind of policy question. I'm just trying to see who asked this question. I'll ask the question and I'll name the person when I can find this, so that you can tell that your question's been addressed. Somebody asked, would it be binding, in terms of kind of legally binding, the outcome of mediation as part of a resolution policy, and therefore does mediation remain voluntary for people? Those two questions.
That's a great question. Well, mediation, it is voluntary for parties to enter into it. All we're doing here is normalising mediation and making it a normal, cultural, acceptable, mainstream activity within your business. But the decision to enter into the process or not lies firmly with the parties involved. There are three elements of voluntarism in mediation: the voluntary entry to mediation, the voluntary exit of mediation, and the voluntary settlement of the dispute. The model resolution policy recognises self-determination and voluntarism on those three different levels. We're probably putting a bit more emphasis on the entry to mediation, but certainly the party's decision to exit the process or settle very much lies with them. It's not legally binding. If the parties wish to pursue other processes, obviously with the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Act, come April the 6th, the individual, if they did want to go to employment tribunal to test their case, they would still be required to go to conciliation through the early conciliation process at ACAS. So the answer to the question very simply is no, there isn't a legally binding element to mediation. It is self-determination, it is voluntary.
Great, lovely.
Great. Well, we'll move on. Please do carry on firing away the questions. It's great to have so many questions, and I'm really happy to try and answer as many as I can. Conscious of time, so we're planning on the webinar being around 45 minutes. If I don't get a chance to answer all of your questions, I will try and sit down and send something out via email to everybody. There's questions now covering process, system, structures. Caroline, you've been asking about how we would manage resolution processes where there are five people against 2 managers. Mediation is really well equipped for handling team and group situations, these kind of splits and divides. Probably not for today's webinar, but I do run webinars on handling conflict. We run sessions on team and group situations. But it works really well where there's multiple parties as much as with 2 parties.
On that question, which I didn't name, the attendee, it was Susie Gupta. Thank you for that question, Susie.
Yes, thanks, Susie. So for the employee, the expectation of the employee is that they will raise issues early. That they can expect as an employee. When I was working with an organisation about developing its philosophy around becoming an employee of choice, employees expect to be able to engage in dialogue. They're almost surprised, they almost kind of become acclimatised to these grievance processes. But when you talk to individuals, it's almost like it's an expectation that they would sit down and talk. Well, this reinforces that the employees will engage in early evaluation of the dispute, and they'd expect them to be treated with some compassion as part of this process. Employees can expect to be offered mediation in all cases of disputes, not just the odd one that seems to be the most serious or the one that looks like it's heading into an ET, and we're going to try and cut it off at the pass. Mediation becomes normalised and the employee can expect that. And the employee has the right to request a more formal resolution meeting, and they have the right to representation at that meeting. So there's no diminishing of the employment rights, but the emphasis is much more on early resolution and focus. For the human resources professional, resolving the HR paradox that I talked about at the start of the webinar, that HR will provide a coaching and mentoring service for managers, really supporting managers to resolve situations. That HR will help to develop a set of leadership competences where the issues around emotional intelligence and positive psychology and appreciative inquiry and the things that I've been talking about today are embedded in the leadership framework. So when you appoint your managers, they know what to expect. Someone's told them they're going to be facing these issues. That HR will have an early assessment system and a triage process. It's codified, it's clarified, people know exactly what they're getting. That the HR function will then coordinate and organise the mediation process. If you have a team of internal mediators, HR will be there to organise getting the right mediator in the right room at the right time and ensuring that process is managed effectively. That there will be support in formal and formal resolution meetings, so HR will have an important role there, and that HR will continue to review the impact and the return on investment that this is having within their organisation, that they will measure the real cost, and that then would be reported to board, and board will then understand the impact, the cost benefit, the real change that your policy is creating. And the most effective mediation programs and resolution programs that we create, there's a direct relationship between the senior management team, the board, the unions, and other key players within the business. And for managers, they'll engage in resolution skills training. This is just part of what they do, is getting better resolutions to their difficult situations. That they'll possess and be appraised against core resolution competences. I've been working with a large bank recently. I've been working with them for a number of years, but they've recently implemented a values framework within the organisation. Now 50% of the annual appraisal of all managers within the organisation is against how they've contributed to the values of that bank. That is one of the biggest implementation of the values that I've ever seen within an organisation. And that's sending out a really clear message from that bank to its leaders that they would expect there to be visibility from the management behaviours and leadership competences about delivering the values within that bank. That the manager will help to foster a culture of constructive engagement and resolution within teams. This isn't just a nice to have, this is a need to have to be able to generate the future Facebooks of tomorrow, to be innovative and positive. And that they'll facilitate dialogue and resolve issues. They won't duck issues, they won't stick their head in the sand. They won't go onto the Viking website and try and find the latest version of the too difficult to deal with today inbox that always seems to be sold out on Viking. Of course it doesn't exist, so nod to Viking, if they say, but that's where we tend to put these things. And that they'll walk the talk. They'll be out, management by walking about, it's an old adage, but listening, really hearing. And we're not very good at listening. we need to got active listening is a key part of the process.
That actually links to a question by Estelle Burns. She's talking about does the model cover or reference any consequences for managers who do not comply or meet with the standards of behaviour for effective resolution? She's talking about linking a resolution policy with a behavioural model, with a kind of red, amber, green diagnostic for management behaviours linked to organisational values. What would your thoughts be on that, David?
That's a great question. I think what you're talking there is about embedding competencies that meet the values, and I think where the term consequences is probably the slightly challenging one there. I think it's about being held to account and being responsible for our behaviours, and that will be done through our annual appraisals, through our PDR systems and through our supervisory framework that we deliver for our leaders and managers. So I wouldn't necessarily hold them to account per se for the model resolution policy, because the model resolution policy itself should be linked to the competencies linked to the policies linked to the values. And when I'm sat as a leader being developed by my manager and by my leader, that I'm being tested on my leadership against all of these different elements. And so, yes, how's conflict handled should be part of the appraisal. Yes, how is conflict handled should be part of your engagement surveys. Yes, I do actively encourage where it's handled properly and effectively 360-degree appraisals for managers to be able to be assessed and receive really good quality feedback. But it needs to be done in a managed way, and it's probably the word consequences that I struggle with a little bit there, because it suggests that we might use blame as a way of addressing this. But again, what the model resolution policy, it probably wasn't meant in that way, but it's about being accountable and responsible for driving those changes, and linking it with a behavioural model is absolutely right. For me, it's key, and that behavioural model would be the competences, I think, that I'd be talking about, linked to the values. So yes, I would totally agree with that. Okay, so we've got some more questions here as well, which is great. So I'll move on through the presentation and we'll have a look. So here's some possible resolution approaches that might work for your organisation. So neutral evaluations, that's the kind of triaging process and the resolution assessment early on by managers, by HR professionals, by unions and others. And the unions have a really, really key role to play here, and we're increasingly working with senior union representatives to help develop this culture, not just within HR, not just within leadership, also as part of partnerships between unions and the organisation. Mediation, of course, is a key part of the resolution approach, and the model resolution policy, the beating heart of the policy is mediation. Developing strong teams through team building or team development, circle time, open forums, town halls, those kind of discussion environments where people can raise issues safely and constructively and be heard. Coaching is a major part of what we do as a company, supporting leaders and managers to get better outcomes for themselves and for their teams. The resolution meeting, which would be formally informal resolution, sitting down with my manager's manager, and trying to work through a situation. Investigations which are undertaken quickly, speedily, efficiently, robustly, fairly, which result in a report where the employee can make a clear determination based on the balance of probability. Okay, many investigations seem to go on for far too long, are open-ended, and don't result in a very clear outcome for HR or for the employees. Of course, the formal resolution meeting is at the later stage where the individual has the right to representation to sit down with you, the employer, and try and work out a way forward, and they can then have the right to appeal. Alan, you've asked a question. Sorry, Elaine. You've asked a question about the right to representation seems to conflict with the idea that the parties take personal responsibility for their conflict resolution. That's a great question, and I've really, really taken that view on board and thought about it a lot. However, Alan, it's important that the model resolution policy is not being seen as infringing an employee's rights. If it is, it's going to be a fad, an idea that will come today and go tomorrow, and it won't drive the changes that we need. And in order to be able to secure commitment to the model resolution policy from all key stakeholders, including unions and others, and employees, we need to demonstrate that this isn't going to erode rights that have taken tens and many hundreds of years to develop within our organisations. This is a reframing exercise, not a complete removal of certain rights. And the idea of having the right to representation at the end of the formal appeals process It's to ensure that where there is misconduct and where there is wrongdoing and where you, the employer, recognise that something needs to be done robustly, that you have the ability to do that and you can reach determinations and you can address this in a more formal way. We're recalibrating the process, but we're not removing any employee rights as a part of that. And I think it's a great question, and it's one that I take very, very seriously and spent a lot of time thinking about.
There's a question earlier, David, that I wanted to come back to, which kind of relates to what you're saying. Somebody's given us a kind of case study or an example of, I'm just wondering if you might be able to talk us through how the model resolution policy would help with this situation. So she's talking about a recently redundant employee has put in a grievance against the manager who scored the employee against redundancy criteria supposedly unfairly. The employee had a RSI issue with her thumbs, and as a result of her sickness was high because of it, substantially higher than the others in the pool of candidates for redundancy. And it seems that question seems to relate to those two things that you're talking about: the kind of right for representation, but also something around informal resolution of issues. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how the policy might handle that scenario.
Thank you. So repetitive strain injury by the employee, the manager making the redundancy. So the redundancy criteria, which of course will be set objectively, so I'm assuming the fact that they're scored is sickness absence was one of the objective criteria against which the manager was scoring employees. And the manager would obviously have a responsibility to use the metrics that HR have provided for them to do the score. So I'm going to make some assumptions here, Alice, but I'm going to assume that the metric was number of days sickness in a period. Now the challenge there is if that's the objective criteria that the employer has agreed is the way to measure the redundancy, it's a fairly blunt instrument, because the manager has a responsibility to the employer to measure the metrics based on the objective criteria that have been set, and that wouldn't necessarily be able to take into account mitigating factors. One's sense of fairness and justice suggests, however, that mitigating factors should be being taken into account by the manager as part of the redundancy process. But that isn't always possible, it's not always practical, and many managers are advised not to do that. So the question that I would be asking to the manager and also to the HR professional is what scope was there as part of the objective process that they went through of scoring sickness levels as being one of the criteria, to then take into account workplace injuries like repetitive strain injury, where that was potentially as a result of workplace issues. So I think I'll probably start before the grievance and try and understand a little bit about what's gone wrong, and it's not absolutely clear from the case. Certainly, if the employees raise the grievance, and they clearly have, they've got something they want to say. They obviously feel aggrieved for certain reasons. Again, I don't know what their grievance is about, but I would be looking for an opportunity as an HR professional to bring the employee and the manager together to have a constructive dialogue, to allow for the employee to express clearly to the manager what's gone wrong. What does the employee want? Does the employee want to be heard and to just simply have their say, but they accept the redundancy process? Or are they looking for being brought back into the workplace, or for there to be some kind of financial compensation? So there'll be some questions to be asking there in terms of the needs of the employee, the context of the redundancy decision, and the application of the objective criteria. So there's a few things I'd probably check out first, but certainly in those cases I would imagine mediation would be very useful and could support the parties come together and find either a financial outcome through a settlement agreement, or for the individual employee to talk about why they felt they'd been unfairly treated. So yes, mediation would work there. I could imagine on that short case study that's going to result in some form of a settlement agreement, but again it's too little to know exactly, and I'm happy to talk to Alice offline about how mediation could benefit in that particular case. Thank you. Okay, so we'll move into the final stage of the webinar, and one of the things that we're promoting is doing the webinars, which is great to be able to tell you about what we do as a company, but just and the change we're making. But one of the programs that we've just launched, I ran a pilot of this up in Lancaster last week at Lancaster and Morecambe College for 30 managers, which was incredibly well received. Is a program called Better Resolutions, and this is about giving managers and leaders and HR professionals the training and the skills that they need to be able to handle these situations better. And if you're interested in the model resolution policy, if you're interested in the leadership competencies, or if you're interested in any training for your managers and leaders to help them secure better resolutions, please do let me know, because we'd be very keen to support you. And in essence, this is helping those managers do the job that you need them to be able to do as part of implementing the model resolution policy. So what practical steps to take away perhaps from this webinar? Measure and evaluate the causes and costs of conflict for your organisation so that this is an evidence-based process. Obviously my webinar may have piqued your interest and given you some food for thought. My recommendation now is to go back and really assess what's the real cost of the conflict. We have a conflict tool, we provide it free of charge to any organisation. If you're interested in our cost of conflict calculator and any of our other tools, please do let me know. We'd be very, very happy to share that with you. Embedding mediation into your key policies and processes, making it clear and explicit. You may decide to have a mediation protocol, or you may decide to have a model resolution policy based on what we're talking about. And of course, we're here to support you through that. Training managers, training your HR team to coach and mentor managers at times of conflict, change and crisis. So HR business partners become HR coaches. And of course, training your managers and leaders to secure better resolutions. That's what we do, and we're very happy to support that. We also provide mediation support. If you need a mediator in your organisation right now, if you've got a grievance on your desk right now, please let us know. We'd be very happy to support. And I was working with one major airline, and they had a mediation on their desks. They've been going on for a long time. We managed to settle that, and the general manager called us into a meeting and said, "What on earth did you put in their coffee?" And said to the HR director, "I want this mediation thing into our HR strategy because it's resolved one of the most difficult disputes that we've ever known as an airline." So if you have a difficult dispute and you're interested in mediation and testing mediation, then please do let us know. So questions and answers, I think we've been doing that as we've gone along. We're a little bit over on the time, so forgive me for that, especially on Valentine's Day. You're probably wanting to get off and do whatever you're doing on Valentine's Day. I hope you have a very, very lovely Valentine's Day evening, whatever you're doing. And there are a few other questions. People have asked for copies of policies and examples. We have loads of examples where organisations have embedded policies and procedures. Some of them are confidential, certainly the model resolution policy and any other sample policies we can send, we'll share. We're happy to do that. But you will get a copy of the model resolution policy, and I think when you see that, you'll see that it's a very robust policy. And like I say, it has been and is increasingly been embedded in a whole array of different organisations. So any other questions?
I think there was one question earlier just about equality in terms of the resolution policy, and I imagine, David, that you're going to say that equality sits at the heart of the resolution policy in terms of how it applies to all different employees across the organisation. So anything you want to just say about that?
No, I think it is. I mean, it is about giving everyone an equal opportunity to resolve their disputes in a constructive and positive way. But one of the beauties of mediation is it takes into account difference and divergence in a way which is far more powerful and far more sophisticated than the grievance process, which again is a blunt instrument. It's a kind of one-size-fits-all approach, whereas the mediator understands the narrative of the parties. So the manager who's acting as a mediator, or the internal mediator, is listening to the feelings, the needs, the hopes, the fears, the aspirations, the goals, the difference that we bring to our team. And whilst the mediator on one level looks for areas of convergence about building respect and trust and confidence and communication, we also focus on areas of divergence and difference and build empathy and understanding and appreciation and recognition. So again, for me, mediation dialogue is one of the most powerful ways of building a kind of a really strong, vibrant, diverse workforce. So it's very much about embedding and underpinning your equalities commitments.
Lovely. And I suppose from my own personal perspective, I was really glad to hear that you're talking about the fact that employees' rights won't be eroded, but it's not a replacement of those rights, but it's more a underpinning of other processes that could make going to those rights less necessary because things have been resolved at an earlier stage. And in fact, the model resolution policy balances those two things, redresses the balance of those two approaches, really, rather than it being much more towards the litigation kind of adversarial approach.
Absolutely, I think it absolutely is. The Employment Tribunal is the least best place to go to settle our differences. Grievance processes are the least best place, often in my view, to settle differences. Investigations put a ticking time bomb into the team and should be treated with the greatest of care and the greatest of respect. I'm not saying it shouldn't happen, but we have to really take a long, hard look at what we use and what we rely on, and then really remodel that and reframe it. And absolutely, it's about protecting the rights of the individual, but also ensuring that our businesses can be the best businesses that they can be. And in some respects, organisations who are doing this, for me, as I've said, are courageous, but are also a beacon, a shining light across the world. This is what I think UK can be doing. I think this is the UK model, is we're demonstrating some fantastic innovative practices where collaboration, dialogue is at the heart of what we're trying to do. So
at the heart.
At the heart.
It's nice.
Oh,
nice
yes.
to end with
Oh, very good, Elaine. Didn't even realise I'd done it. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening and for participating, and to everyone who's offered questions. Much appreciated. I'm loving all the positive feedback as well that's coming in. So thank you. You've obviously enjoyed it. So that's very affirming and very much appreciated. So yes, there will be a recording, Kate. I know a few of you have asked that. And yes, the number of you asked about the policy, yes, we will get that out to you as well, so you've got sight of that. And it just leaves me to say, again, thank you very much. And again, there's lots of positive comments coming in, so this is, I'm feeling very positive. So have a lovely weekend, enjoy the rest of your Friday, and look forward to hopefully working with you at some point in the future, if we're not working together already. Thanks, Elaine, and thanks, Michelle. What would I hand over to Michelle to finish us off?
Just obviously my thanks as well. And on exiting the webinar, you're going to have the opportunity to fill in a very short survey. Please do that if you can. It helps us make the webinars better, etc. And just as a little incentive, anyone who fills in this survey is going to have the opportunity to win a place on a one-day course of their choice. We're also going to be emailing you details for our next webinars, and hope you can join us again soon. Many thanks.